Hello, and welcome to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we're going to take a look at regulating carbon dioxide emissions as air pollution and ask the question, is this a lot of hot air, or is it possibly improving air quality? As with all of these ethical dilemmas in science, they're based in part on a recent news article. And so this is an article in response to the Supreme Court decision in June of 2022, basically regulating or at least limiting the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to mandate carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And so, it's a fairly controversial decision. A lot of discussion about it throughout the summer. So let's take a look at what actually is involved with this decision and with carbon dioxide and the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, we have a previous ethical dilemma in science where we've taken a look at the effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so I'm going to provide the link to that below and not go into a whole lot of detail. But at least at this point, just recognize that there's very good science that shows that increased levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases like methane accumulating within the atmosphere are having a warming effect, and that warming effect is contributing to climate change and some of the extreme weather patterns that we've seen most recently. So the severe drought that we've seen in the American West contributing to kind of massive wildfires throughout that region, increased flooding and severity of tropical storms and hurricanes that we're seeing kind of along the American kind of Gulf region as well as the East Coast. And those patterns are repeated around the world. So again, the science is pretty much in line with this idea that at least increased levels of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the environment are contributing to a warming effect that is causing changes in global weather patterns, global climate patterns. So in order to begin to look at what is going on with the Environmental Protection Agency as it relates to carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, I think it's first important to understand what the Environmental Protection Agency is and what its general mandate is, what its general kind of purpose is when we take a look at it as an executive branch agency. And so the Environmental Protection Agency was created and began operations in 1970, and it was a response to a lot of public outcry as well as scientific reports about air and water pollution, as well as other factors that were getting pollutants, pesticides, radon, all kinds of different things that are getting out into the atmosphere and having an effect overall on the environment. Now, getting to the point of air quality, the Clean Air Act was first enacted in 1970, voted in by Congress and signed by President Richard Nixon, and it's gone through a series of revisions over the last close to 52 years now at this point. Major revisions in 1977 and 1990. Now, what we can see is a pretty dramatic change in the, at least, environment in many urban areas and many areas where there's industrial production. And so this is a National Geographic article from 2015 showing the Los Angeles skyline in the 1980s. And you can see that a lot of the buildings, a lot of the appearance is obscured by the presence of smog, by the presence of air pollution, particulate pollution that is building up in this low atmosphere. And it has a very dramatic effect on the individuals that are breathing that in. And so in response to this increase in smog and increase in pollution, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Air Act were put into effect in 1970. And we can see, there were improvements by the 1980s, but very dramatic improvements in the time since then. And so dramatic reductions in the pollution, in the particulate matter, in things that are found within the air. Now, in general, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Air Act focuses in on 6 common pollutants and those are going to be particulate matter, which are like ash and smoke and kind of all manner of small kind of debris that can be found in the air. Also includes kind of droplets of fluids that would be suspended in the air. It looks at ground level ozone qualities, things like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead. And so, at the outset, just starting out, again, this National Geographic article talks about what has been shown with improvements to children's health and a lot of other scientific articles showing improvements in health in general associated with improving air quality. Now, if we take a look, this is a graph from the Environmental Protection Agency going from 1990 upwards to 2018. The dashed line across the middle is taking a look at the national standards for these different air pollutants. And in general, what we can see is that as early as 1990, many of them were down below the recommended levels, the national standards, and the ones that were not under the levels at that point have been kind of brought under control. They've been able to reduce much of the air pollution in the environment through the enactment of the Clean Air Act and the actions of the Environmental Protection Agency working with state governments to establish the standards, to establish the guidelines for reducing pollution and improving air quality. Now, one of the major focuses of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Air Act was to improve air quality because of the effect of air pollution on health. Now, worldwide, air pollution is estimated to be the fourth greatest overall risk factor for human health. So it's coming in a little bit behind high blood pressure, dietary risks, and smoking, but it still has a significant effect in making certain diseases worse. So it will exacerbate, the air pollution will exacerbate individual conditions if they have things like ischemic heart disease, stroke, and various forms of cancers such as tracheal cancers, bronchial cancers, as well as lung cancers. A WHO World Health Organization study in 2019 indicated that it appears as if even 99% of the global population is in areas where there is air quality in which at least one factor is exceeding, basically one factor is still in a dangerous or at least non-recommended level within the air. So the studies have shown that air pollution and poor air quality have a dramatic effect on the health of individuals. A study that was conducted in 2021 and published in Environmental Health Perspectives shows that there is kind of a disparate exposure to air pollution within the United States based on where people are going to be located. And so this study is looking at race and ethnicity as well as income. The slide that I've got up here is taking a look at the percentage of racial ethnic minority residents in a population going from very low levels of racial and ethnic minority residents to a high level over here at the right, and then different types of air pollution. So we're looking at carbon monoxide on this slide, as well as particulate matter. So that's the debris that's up in the air. What we can see is the blue line represents 1990, the red line 2000, and then the yellowish line 2010. So we're seeing good improvement over the last 20 years. It's reported in this paper, but we can still see that in general, areas that have lower proportions or lower percentages of racial and ethnic minorities tend to have lower levels of pollution, air pollution, than areas that have higher levels of minorities. Again, so this is another example of a health disparity that needs to be looked at and addressed. Things are getting better, but there are, still disparate distribution of the exposure to the air pollution, and there is, again, good, strong evidence that air pollution is causing health conditions and exacerbation of existing health conditions. So getting closer to this question of what is the role of the Environmental Protection Agency in possibly regulating greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide. And so in 2009, the Environmental Protection Agency determined that carbon dioxide and other long-lived greenhouse gases, like methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases, accumulate within the atmosphere. When they accumulate within the atmosphere, they are going to be endangering the health and welfare of individuals. And so in 2009, the Environmental Protection Agency began making concerted efforts to establish gas emission standards and fuel economy standards. And so this is supported by a Supreme Court decision in 2007 that basically agreed with the fact that the Clean Air Act will extend the definition of air pollutant to also include greenhouse gases. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency is also making an effort to control large source emissions that are contributing to these greenhouse gases. And so, they make good progress with greenhouse gas regulations, so emissions from motor vehicles. They've done things like, again, like I mentioned, improving fuel standards, so people can get cars that are getting more miles to the gallon. They are implementing requirements that we use renewable biofuels. And so if you take a look at the gasoline when you're refilling your car, you're going to see that many times they're going to have a certain percentage of ethanol, which is going to be present. And they also began to implement requirements that the construction of large, new, and modified, basically reconstructed or renovated stationary sources of greenhouse gases, such as power plants, cement manufacturers, and refineries, have to use the best available control technology to minimize their gas emissions. Now, when we take a look at what the Environmental Protection Agency does, as an agency of the executive branch of the United States government, they have to establish guidelines as to what is kind of an appropriate and safe level of these materials within the air. And so the way that they do that is illustrated on this slide, and it's something that is an ongoing process. They're making revisions to the standards, generally on about a 5-year basis, but it's based on scientific input. And so kind of starting onto this diagram, a number of studies taking a look at the health environmental impacts of whatever factor it is that they're looking at. Many of these are going to be peer-reviewed scientific articles that have been vetted and published in esteemed scientific journals. They use that information to come up with kind of a statement of fact, a document that kind of assesses and summarizes these scientific studies. And then that review is going to be, that document is going to be kind of evaluated by the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, as well as open to public comment. As a response of those comments, they're then going to use basically the facts that have been determined to try to establish some type of standards, some type of requirements or guidelines for what level of these materials are going to be safe and appropriate within the air. Again, that is reviewed by the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, as well as open to public comment. And then they will come up with proposed decisions on the standards. They would, basically go into a rulemaking process, put out what those rules are as a proposal, in essence, and then the whole public hearings, collect public comments, and then revise and come up with a final decision based on those standards. So the Environmental Protection Agency has been establishing standards for carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, looking at a major source of those emissions having come from power plants, power generation plants. In 2015, the Obama administration with the Environmental Protection Agency proposed a Clean Power Plan, which established customized goals to reduce carbon pollution for power plants, both new and existing. But very quickly, in 2016, the Supreme Court issued a stay that prevented the implementation of the Clean Power Act. Ultimately, in 2019, the Environmental Protection Agency under the Trump administration repealed the Clean Power Plan and attempted to replace that with the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And so this is a rule that, again, would be establishing guidelines for the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, at that point, a coalition of about 22 states that were adversely affected by climate change, so affected by rising sea levels, increased flooding, increased wildfires, challenged the EPA decision to repeal the Clean Power Act, mainly because they were concerned, as we can see here, that this new plan is basically going to kind of change what they're going to be doing for emissions of carbon dioxide. So they're going from like a 16% limit down to, or the amount of reductions would be going from a 16% reduction to less than a 1% reduction. Again, this was looked at, in this case, by the DC Circuit Court, and then they basically put in a vacation of the rule, or the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And so at this point, there was no rule in place talking about carbon dioxide emissions for power generation plants. Ultimately, in a Supreme Court decision in 2022, in response to a lawsuit brought by the state of West Virginia against the Environmental Protection Agency, and that lawsuit was joined by Republican attorneys general from a dozen states, basically states that were involved with a lot of coal energy production or coal production, were basically challenging these rules and the ability of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate carbon emissions through the burning of coal in these existing power plants. Now, the main reason for that is they said that the EPA kind of went beyond their mandate, and these regulations would require what they were defining as a generation shifting approach that would require electric generation plants to convert from fossil fuel, in many cases coal, into a renewable form of energy. And so there's a question whether or not the congressional mandate to the Environmental Protection Agency gave them the ability to make decisions, as it was described in this decision, to make decisions of vast economic and political significance. And so there is the problem then that, again, a statement by Chief Justice, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roberts said, capping carbon dioxide emissions at a level that will force a nationwide transition away from the use of coal to generate electricity may be a sensible solution to the crisis of the day. But only Congress or an agency with express authority from Congress can adopt a decision of such magnitude and consequence. And so basically it said that the Environmental Protection Agency kind of overstepped their mandate in trying to implement these rules. Now, the overall decision with this is that it's going to slow the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it would be potentially impacting or impairing the investment in green energy and the innovations associated with green energy sources. Like many conflicts we see with science and the implementation of scientific information is a potential conflict between science and the economy. And so in many cases, at least in the Supreme Court's case, we saw one of the major arguments was if we phase out these coal generating plants, it's going to have an economic impact on the coal producers. It's going to have an economic impact on the companies that are producing electricity by burning coal. And so there is this conflict then between scientists and economists. And so this is an article from 2014 in The Conversation talking about an effort by Australia to get to zero carbon emissions without impacting their economic growth. And then over on the other side, I've got a slide from the Energy Information Agency of the United States government that shows, we've changed where we've gotten our energy from over the last, over history, but especially when we're taking a look at generation of electricity. We saw that, it started out fairly high with coal, but the coal has been reducing. Petroleum still remaining pretty high, and this graph only goes up to 2012. but now we're seeing some of those renewables start to appear in the 1980s, and this has only continued to grow. And so there is this natural replacement, this natural change in where we're going to be getting our energy. The question is, how fast are we going to be making that change? So this gives rise to our ethical dilemma in science for this week, where we ask the question, should carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases be considered air pollutants? How should the perspective of scientists and economists, which may have differing views on the impact of these decisions, be considered in establishing national rules for greenhouse gases? How should greenhouse gases be regulated at a national level? And then what level of regulation should require a delegated agency such as the Environmental Protection Agency to seek and receive clear and explicit guidance from Congress? And this is a question, especially in light of our highly polarized legislative environment right now. How can we address these very important decisions in a timely manner? We're looking at pretty dramatic changes in the climatic patterns. We're seeing 100 or 1,000-year floods, 100 or 1,000-year storms that would be expected to occur once in 100 years, once in 1,000 years, occurring much more recently, and a pattern of seeing those extreme storms over the last couple of years. And so it appears as if there is a need to be able to start doing something about this in the short term. This is not something that we can wait 5 or 10 or 20 years to try to come up with a solution for. So thank you for listening to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science. Please see the description below for additional information and references. Thank you and have a great week.